I now would like to invite the board to turn to agenda item 9, performance review of the GCF. Information contained in document GCF/B24/10 entitled the Secretariat Management Response to the Forward-Looking Performance Review of the GCF. You recall in decision B23/06, the board requests Secretariat to provide a management response to the forward-looking performance review of the GCF to the board for consideration at this session. I would like now to give the floor to the Secretariat to provide us with presentations on the response, the management response, but I also would like to request the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit to join us here in case of any questions later on. Hafir, my pleasure to have the floor, to give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair. Members of the board, good morning. I would like to start by greeting and welcoming everyone to Asondo and to the GCF family. So a forward-looking performance review of the GCF and the management response. And I would like to start by giving you some background. This comes from a mandate under the decision B21/17. It was followed by a presentation by the Independent Evaluation Unit at the B23, and a decision from the board at that same meeting of the 23 on B23/06, where it states that the board takes note of the first review of the performance of the GCF by the IEU, also takes note of the findings and recommendations presented in the final report of the forward-looking performance review of the GCF, request the Secretariat to provide a management response to the forward-looking performance review of the GCF at B24, and decides to continue its consideration of this matter at B24. Therefore, this presentation tries to address the board decision as of B23. The GCF has achieved a lot, and it has fulfilled the mandate to a large extent given by the UNFCCC through the GCF's governing instrument in many areas. The GCF has the requisite capacity, is a learning disposition, leadership and structures for being an agent of change, if I may say, an agent of transformational change. Management appreciates the documentation of the GCF achievements in the last 4 years, and also welcomes and agrees with identifications of opportunities for the GCF to realize a greater paradigm-shifting impact for developing countries, and through deep diving into 3 sections. The first one being a theory of change, and a theory of change that it wouldn't make any sense if it's not to achieve transformational change. Then 2 additional pillars. One of them pertains to the business model, and the other one to the operational modalities. In terms of the business model, we will be covering improving access, innovation, leverage, and results. And in terms of the operational model performance, project and policy development processes to enhance responsiveness and transparency, HR matters, and knowledge and partnership development. Work is and has been underway throughout the year. Today's board agenda is a response somehow to the performance, to the forward-looking performance review, as it is also the strategic planning, and by the fact that the Secretariat has been addressing from the beginning of the year several of the FPR's findings and recommendations. There is a section in the FPR pertaining to strategic direction, and more precisely on sharpening GCF's strategic direction. There are key FPR findings that align rather well with the recommendations presented at the strategic programming. We're talking about strategic goals to enhance direct access, adaptation, private sector, mobilizing finance and mobilizing finance at scale. It also pertains to clarifying approach to programming, expanding access modality, and diversifying instruments for innovation, value, and impact. And lastly, leveraging and replicating knowledge. A draft strategic plan 2020-2023 is underpinned by the GCF's comparative advantage, and it is stable for board consideration. It's the first time that the Secretariat takes on this assignment, and a draft strategic plan is presented for board discussion and consideration within B24. The overall strategic directions will be guided, as it should be, by the board. As an example, we are reminding everyone that during the IRM, the board decided that the allocation parameters, including mitigation and adaptation balance, to be determined in grant equivalent terms. As of B23, the distribution was 48% on mitigation and 52% on adaptation. As the other two pillars, one of them related to the business model, key aspects of the GCF business model are currently under board review. Many of the proposals would respond to the FPR findings, and in the areas particularly on improving access, innovation, leverage, responsiveness, and performance, we will be looking during the next board meetings, including this one, to important areas like accreditation framework, investment framework, modalities under the private sector facility, and an integrated results management framework. On the other hand, we do believe that implementation and disbursement rates are not low, given the level of the portfolio maturity. They have picked up significantly during 2019 and will continue to pick up pace, aided by policy and processes improvements. Let's look a little bit at implementation and the fact that it's picking up. The board has approved thus far 111 funding proposals for $5.2 billion. Out of those, $3.1 billion are under implementation. This is to say about 60% of all the approvals are under implementation. When we talk about FAA execution, 29 FAAs have been signed so far for $1.4 billion this year. And importantly, it was brought up by the Executive Director this morning on the report of activities. It was during B23, one FAA was signed right after the board decision on the funding proposal approval. Nowadays, we are in a position to, and well equipped to, perhaps sign even up to 3, obviously if they are approved by the board. Right after, we would be able to sign up to 3 FAAs. The amount of FAAs so far this year is $1.4 billion, and for a total of 81 FAAs, and this will well trigger and surpass the objective of the year. This is about 70% of our funding proposals now do have an FAA that has been executed. That's $3.6 billion of the whole portfolio that is nowadays technically under FAA signing. In terms of operational modalities, speeding up the processes, let me give you an update The Secretariat has taken a number of steps to improve processes and performance. In terms of the project cycle mapping, a lot of work has been done during the last 7 months. We have completed and refined the project cycle. We have reviewed what we call the Secretariat second level due diligence. We have go and deepen into the organizational design, and that has been completed. We have also completed a readiness guidebook. And what is work in progress, we have the operations manual to be finalized before the end of the year. Likewise, for a funding proposal manual to be ready by the end of 2019. We're strengthening the project level results management. That is work that is ongoing. And also, as it was presented this morning, we have a real-time program management information system, work ongoing. We have seen a video clip this morning. The rolling of this real-time will be throughout 2020, a pilot on the first, second quarter, and fully implemented by the third quarter. Just a picture of the refinement of our project cycle. The stage of origination and pipeline development, moving into the second level due diligence, independent appraisal, and implementation. And in terms of policy and governance, presented by the FPR, what we do agree is that the experience shows that policies do affect pace of implementation, but not only policies, obviously, but the complexity and the depth of change of those policies do affect the pace of implementation. It's important to balance this, therefore, the value of policy stability with rationalization of policy. The board is considering to review a proposal for a 4-year strategic policy agenda. That would be as part of the strategic plan. And if taken and if approved, thereafter the Secretariat would develop a policy mapping and prioritization in line with the strategic plan. In a different context, but also related to policy and governance, the GCF currently relies on a very legalistic approach to risk management. In our view, wider P&Is would allow room for the GCF to reorient its compliance-based approach, and I think that would have something of an important implication as to avoid ongoing risk to board members, to the investments of the GCF, and to the Secretariat personnel. Implementation would also be aided by clarifying matters related to governance, such as more delegation of authority to the Secretariat to allow adaptive management, cancellation policy as an example, in between board decisions, and strategic programming. And with this, I finish. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you indeed, Javier, for a very good report. With this, I would like now to turn to the board for any comments, observation, questions to Javier. Floor is open. Ayman.
Thank you very much, Javier. Good to see you, Javier, again. And thanks for the presentation, especially the implementation part of it. That's what really concerns us the most, is that how fast, how speedy we are going about our business and accelerating and making the impact on the ground. There is so much you raised in your presentation. I just tried to capture a couple of them. Of course, again, please keep us who we are. Keep this fund to be an operating entity of the Convention that serves both the Convention and the Paris Agreement, yeah? We all not disagree on that. We all, I think we have an agreement that this is a fund to serve both the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and we all adore Paris Agreement, and we like a Paris Agreement, perhaps. Okay, all right, let me just stop there. But we have, see, by the way, those screens here are very confusing. Every time you look, you are on the side, line of sight with your fellow co-chair, and you keep nodding, and you don't know he or she is looking at you, and you keep smiling. You don't know who's, whether or not. So can we adjust those screens, please? Put them somewhere here or there, please. Going back to the I don't know.
Maybe this is like, a very
Holly and I keep looking at each other. I don't know. Are you looking here or looking at the screen? Just it's a bit confusing. Anyway, going back there, please, Javier. You are a veteran of this fund. Perhaps you are the longest-serving person, or among the longest-serving. And you know how we started this fund. We really started it to be an entity that will help developed countries to fulfill their commitment, and developing countries to be assisted to take climate actions and adaptation as a priority, and mitigation as an action, as much as they can do within their capacity. So we want to keep it as such, please. This issue of co-financing, leveraging is quite concerning to us. Private sector for us is a monster. It's something that we're really worried about. When you say private sector, meaning that we're going to have to pay for it. It's not, private sector doesn't come for charity. Private sector means that they come and invest, and we pay them with a margin on top of it. I'm sorry, no offense, but all what I'm saying is that it's just something that we need to be careful about. We would want to do it, subject to our ability to deliver, but not to make it as a target. It's there, it's in the convention, it's in governing instrument, but not to be the mainstream. We really want to do that. You touch upon the, there's so much I really can speak about, but I'll leave room for my other colleagues. I see Jorge is raising his flag, so I'm going to leave it for him, because there is so much to speak about. Really, Joe, forward-looking, evaluation is causing us issues here, really. Just as much as we want to be progressive, as much as we want to be open to creativity and innovation and move the fund to, second level, all that is really dangerous from our perspective. Again, we're going back to the basic fundamental position. We will not accept shifting financing liability to developing countries. It's not about the scale of the financing, because we know where to go. If we need financing, there are resilient institutions out there that we can go at market rate, get loans, and do what we want to do. It's not about that. It's about really delivering on the commitments here that are established in the Convention and under Paris Agreement. I would wish to touch upon the governance issue. I think we have all policies in place, and developing policy is not an objective by itself. We will only develop a policy if you think that there are gaps in policies on the basis of needs. And to Yannick, if you feel like there is something you need to do and you don't have a policy, you just go about it and do it, and don't wait for a policy, and then you'll come back to us and tell us, I did this and this and this and that, because I needed to take action in certain areas, although there is no policy, but I took the executive position to decide on that. And then we'll hold you accountable for your actions. Make no mistake. If there is something went wrong, we'll tell you, no, this is not acceptable. I mean, we don't hold back our operation because of the policy issues. And I think we have covered so many policies over the years, and we keep working on those policies, try to close all those gaps. But we don't want to make this policy development, a policy review, an objective by itself. It's a necessity. It's not something that we would want to do. One of the governance issues that I have a problem with, and it's been there for a while, it's not on this agenda for now, is the code of conduct for the staff of the Secretariat. I, for one, have come across certain areas where staff members of the Secretariat are exerting something beyond the policies. They have their own perspective, they have their own views when they look at funding proposals, and this is something we need to really keep in check, that as much as I am a staff member and I have my own perspective on certain funding proposals, I would still be governed by the policies of the fund. And I would isolate myself as an expert in the Secretariat from the background that I come from and from the funding proposal that I have on the table. I treat them on the merits of the funding proposal as per the policies of the fund and the objective of the fund, not as what I think and the background that I come with. And I can give you cases for that if you wish. But we need to have that governance, I think, gap closed, which is the code of conduct for the Secretariat. And I proposed like 2-3 board meetings in the past, a language for a recourse that if an NDA felt like there was unfair, unjust treatment of their funding proposal because of the experts from the Secretariat looking at that, there is a recourse for an appeal that can be filed under the IRM for that. And this is something very important. We have a recourse against the board, we have a recourse against the NDA, but we don't have a recourse against the staff and the Secretariat. This is a major governance gap that we really need to close. I'll just leave it there. Perhaps I'll come back to see if my colleagues will raise the other points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayman. Next we have Masahiro. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Co-Chairman. It is always difficult to speak after Ayman. Anyway, so I appreciate the FPR carried out by Independent Evaluation Unit. So in that review, the activities, current situation, and issues of GCF so far have been well analyzed, and useful recommendations corresponding to them have been described. In particular, it pointed out that projects that contribute to the paradigm shifting in economy and society should be prioritized. And also, it made a recommendation regarding improvement of accreditation framework and analysis for strengthening the role of the private sector. This is useful for showing the future direction of GCF's activities. So in that sense, as for the management response by the Secretariat, so I appreciate the detailed explanation by the Secretariat, and I appreciate that IEU review is generally accepted in the management response, and some reforms such as board's review of the accreditation framework, investment framework, PSF modality and result management framework, and also finalizing of sectoral programming guidelines by the Secretariat have already begun toward realizing a paradigm shift. So I would like to continue to pay attention to whether the necessary reforms can be steadily implemented to strengthen GCF's activities. And I have one thing to add. So regarding the delegation of authority to the Secretariat, included in the recommendation 4, I recognize that it is not, so we should discuss in other agenda later, but it will be considered preferentially in the future by the board. And it should be considered based on the entire GCF mechanism, GCF organization, and the check and balance and delineation of responsibility among the board, each department of the Secretariat, and the independent unit is very necessary to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next, I have Jorge.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and I also want to thank Javier and the Secretariat for the drafting of the document and its presentation. Well, we have two complex documents in front of all. The performance review and the management response. Well, like any other human actions, they are perfectible. They are not perfect, like the work of the Secretariat or the work of the board. So we are not here to adopt or to welcome or to endorse all the findings, all recommendations, all response from the Secretariat. Many of them are included in the draft or in the generalized ideas of the work program for the next 4 years. I will be considered and taken up on the corresponding agenda items in these meetings, in future meetings. So while we thank both of you for for these documents. We cannot deal in detail in 1 hour with more than 400 pages of the review. We have share some of your findings and some of your recommendations, but we do not share some of your findings and some of your recommendations. This is the opinion of the unit or the drafters of the document, as well as the drafters of the response from the Secretariat, but I don't think that the board is in a position to be agreeing entirely with any of the documents. So we will see in the future when the issues being discussed on detail on the work program, plan, action plan, etc., and on the corresponding meetings and agenda items, how to react to that. But I would like also to contextualize that we would like to see a better performance reviews for the future. A more balance of sources, to take into account more the political realities of the world and the needs of the countries. There are in the reviews there are inherent contradictions in some area. I will not go on detail on that. I did so when we met on the replenishment process in the consultations in Oslo, in Canada, and also in Paris in the pledging conference, and also in some of the meetings here and in consultations with developing countries, etc. There is no time to go on the details, but in some areas there is not really are not based in ground and do not recognize realities. I also support entirely what Ayman has said. There are many reasons why we have certain policies, why we have the governing instrument that is like the constitution of the law of the laws. Here, we are not here after 7 years of hard work of dozens of people from developed and developing countries here in the board and in the COP to redesign in 6 months according to the wishes of a group of researchers, academicians, and officers, to redesign completely and to do away with what we have. This is not perfect, it's right, but we have to go step by step. And nobody should be challenging, while others, with a great effort, has done for many years. Frankly speaking, I saw the review very hypocritical, almost with everything, and having some phrase of recognition of some areas of outcome of the fund. But in general, everything is challenged, from the governing instrument, from the policies, for the accreditation framework, the investment framework, the principles, the governance structure, etc., etc. The financial instruments. That's not fair, frankly speaking. I have stated earlier, and we expect for the future a more balanced view, of course, recognizing that human beings are not perfect. We don't do everything right, but there is also behind many reasons why some issues are decided that way and not in other way. And of course, what we have now is a result of a great number of people, the collective wisdom, with all these limits, that also is within the boundaries of world realities and ground situations and diverse situations in developing countries. It's for sure that no document, neither the governing instrument, no policy from the Secretariat or the board will be able to solve everything or will be perfect to fit everything and to weigh really to satisfy everybody's minds or everybody's thoughts or everybody's backgrounds, because we are all coming from different backgrounds and seeing the things from different perspectives. And of course, we will never agree on everything. That's something out of question. That's not possible. Again, I want to recognize the effort of the Secretariat, the effort of the unit, that those involved. Don't take this that we are not minimizing your work, but you have to understand that these are opinions, like mine, like Ayman, like anyone else. And we have different perspectives, different background, different political and economical thoughts, and therefore we will never agree, all of us, on everything that is in any of the two papers. We will be considering this appropriately, step by step, in different meetings, different agenda items, and of course, there is always room to improve the work of everybody, Secretariat, Board, the unit, the accredited entities, the NDAs, etc. So don't take it that this to adopt or not to adopt, to endorse, to approve, entirely that's out of question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Just to guide the discussion here, I think we're having this exchange here in order to help us as co-chairs to come up with a proposed decision for you. So it will be good if we focus our comments on the response by the Secretariat in such a way that will help us to come up with a proposal for you the way forward. Next, I have Ali.
Thank you, Najmuddin, for giving me the floor. And now I'm feeling more comfortable speaking after Jorge. It's very fortunate for me. First, I would like to thank you for the report. And I'm confident, I'm quite sure that we have good hands when you are here in the Secretariat for performing the tasks and the mandates of the GCF for its functioning, better and smoothing functioning of the GCF. We are all trying to improve the way that Secretariat and the GCF as a whole will perform its duties and tasks and mission. I also would like to raise some not issues, but some areas of concern regarding the performance of the Secretariat, performance of the GCF. And I would like to start from your wording that to me is a bit alarming, and you just highlighted very rightly that the changes in the policies and the practices and the procedures of the GCF and the Secretariat, of course most of them are mandated to the Secretariat by the Board, have impact on the performance of and the implementation of the GCF, implementation track of the GCF. So we have to be very mindful that we need to keep continuity, and continuity has almost a merit. Of course, change sometimes is necessary, it's quite helpful, but it's the change for the sake of the change is not really good for the outcomes, for the outcomes and for the performance of the GCF. So this is the first thing that I wanted to just emphasize on that the continuity is sometimes more advantageable for the work of the GCF than the change. So the rapid change is not something that always brings us to the wishful results. And also you raised the issue of private sector and the importance, and also Ayman also has a reference to that matter. Of course, for us as a developing country, private sector is really important. We have to try our best to give them the opportunity, give them the tools, the capacity to be more active, to be more engaged, especially for the public goods of the climate change and the mitigation and adaptation activities. However, in our countries, we are really facing with such a challenge that when you are trying to impose some kind of conditions, eligibility, some standards, some procedures on the private sector, and the private sector is not in a position to do that because this private sector in our country are subject to the public sector, and the regulations, rules, and all these things comes from the public sector, the government, and the whole society. And it's not in their hand to do what really you are expecting from to do. And telling that, and just I want to say that if we are put pressure on them to do this and to that, they will face eventually to a failure. They will not be able to go in that line, unless otherwise we give them some flexibility. And the flexibility is really important for them. And it gives them the opportunity, the tool to maneuver, but of course within the frames, to maneuver in between and to get to that results. And the last but not the least, I need to flag another issue which is important. For the performance review, we need indicators. I'm not really quite sure that we do have such indicators or not. For me, indicators are not only a matter of objective indicators. Sometimes it's a subjective indicators. If you ask me what would be the best to judge or evaluate or review the work which has been done by the GCF, I will tell you that please go to the ordinary people, to the stakeholders in each and every country and ask them whether, how you expect, for example, if you provide a funding proposal, how long you expect to have this project to be pipelined. Would it be speedy or not? How you would be able to address the obstacles, the issues which would hinder you or prevent you to have access. So these are the things that we need to take into account, and when we are going to put together the indicators for reviewing performance. And again, I thank you very much. And I'm very much hopeful that with your presence in the GCF, we will get a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali. Next, I have Klu.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. And I think I allude to the fact that my colleagues have already indicated that before us we have a complex report which has some of the key emerging concepts which we still grappling with them. We still have to acquaint ourselves with some of the key emerging concepts that are contained in this document. However, I think of particular concern from my side is the greater emphasis of non-grant for adaptation. Coming from a developing country, we know how adaptation, how developing countries, how vulnerable people are at risk. And the greater emphasis of non-grant for adaptation is one of the greater concerns that I want to raise, with a greater push of the private sector. In as much as we understand that the private sector will have a role to play, but we believe that the private sector cannot be a substitute of the grant for adaptation. It's something that should be looked at it quite very closely. Thank you.
Thank you, Klu. Next is Norman.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And I would not go into the details what other colleagues have said about the forward-looking performance review and the management response. But I would just like to reiterate some of the issues which also the other colleagues have highlighted. First of all, in our view, the forward-looking performance review should have been made consistent with the mandate of the GCF itself, which was enshrined in the governing instrument and the COP guidance. It is the board who has to interpret the governing instrument and the COP guidance, not the unit itself. We saw a number of new concepts; those were introduced in the review, which we think go much more, or you can say, stretches the limit of the fund itself. And yesterday also I mentioned some of the issues about the GCF being a thought leader. I think this was not the underlying assumption when this fund was created. It was actually to deliver on concrete adaptation and mitigation projects. So I would leave it over here. This was just an overarching observation. We have also seen that many of the recommendations of the review have been incorporated in the strategic plan without being considered by the board itself, and in the absence of management response, which was yet to be considered by the board. Although it's a sequencing issue, but it also challenges our I thought that in what sequence things are to be incorporated in important documents of the fund. It should have been ideally considered by the board first, and after our deliberations, all those areas which we thought or which we would have thought that are needed to be captured in the strategic plan should have been introduced. So this is another observation. There's one element about the adaptation that Tilu has mentioned. I think a significant emphasis has been laid on the non-grant instruments and the role of the private sector. I also happen to be on the private sector advisory group, where we have considered this aspect, and we see the challenges that are there in the involvement of the private sector in the adaptation projects. So the type of emphasis which is being given here, we see that it is something which does not take into account many of the aspects which even the private sector advisory group has considered. So I would tread very cautiously on this path. We do see an important role of the private sector, but not on a substitute basis. It should be complementing the grant nature of the adaptation financing. The next element is about the governance. I think Eamon, Jorge, and other colleagues have highlighted this aspect. We do see that there are a number of policies which are very important to the fund, and I noted one of the observation that policies do affect the pace of implementation. Certainly they do, and that's why we need to fast track the implementation, and we do appreciate the Secretariat's effort in reorienting themselves. In terms of whenever the policy is reviewed or policy is designed, the Secretariat recalibrates its approach. And that's why I yesterday highlighted a point that we need to evolve, and change has to be steady. And I recall a comment that we must make haste but slowly. It should not be in a way that we unravel things that we have established in the past and go away with the structures and mechanism we have created. So I would just say that the Secretariat need to be consistent, has to be steady, and has to be firm while adjusting itself with the policies. And the reviews which we envisage are to actually identify that whether the policies are actually translated into actions and whether there are gaps. They should not be coming up with new policies which I think all of us are experienced enough in the system that we do recognize that what policies have not been working and why they have not been working. This is one area. There was an issue, and I would like to understand from the Secretariat about the wider P&I's reorient compliance-based approach. So I need to understand, because P&I is an issue which the fund is facing, and there are a number of reasons that why the fund is facing the privilege and immunities issue. I think when there are problems to get the P&Is in the country, there are certain reasons why. Because some countries, they do have problems related to the host country agreements and whether the GCF office is present over there or not. So I think we should not close our eyes on this aspect, but we should address it, that how to address that gap in the P&Is, because this is a consistent issue that the fund is facing. But I think we need to have a more open discussion how to get away, because with the current progress on the P&Is, we do not think that the board is going, or the fund is going to get the sort of P&Is which is aspiring. There are many entities, UN entities, which have P&Is, but those have P&Is because of their organizations present in the countries. So I think I would just highlight this issue at this point. I do not have a solution to this, but I would just like to highlight that the approach which the fund is maintaining, it is not going to achieve that, because the fund does not have resident offices in countries. So, because those have taxation issues, other immunities that are granted to the person who was serving in a country. So I'll just leave it here at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Roman. Next, I have Hans Olof.
Thank you. Let me start by picking up Neumann's point on making haste but slowly. We've used this before, Neumann, in a different setting, but actually I don't see the FPR is actually proposing a revolution there. It's just basically trying to help us to give us some strategic guidance to start filling out the map so we know where we're heading. So I think we are actually make haste but slowly. So it's just it will take us at least a step forward. I note there's also different views on key areas in the board, and I think we just have to acknowledge the different views. I'm not going to engage in a passionate discussion whether private or public sector coming from Norway, where everything is more or less public anyway, but it doesn't really matter. But we can do this offline or in a different setting. That's why I think there's actually a need for us to meet also under different circumstances to try to start teasing out some of our differences. But 3 quick points. I would like to thank the IAU for the forward performance review, and also to Javier and the Secretariat for providing a really well thought through management response. I think the management response to me actually confirms the FPR findings. I've seen a lot of management responses. I've been subjected to preparing management responses myself. And of course, we quite often don't like the outcome of evaluations, and it's our job to then come up with a management response. And I hardly see any differences in views. There are few areas where management has a different view than the FPR, but that's something we had to expect, that there is some differences in views. For me, this will be a major input to our further deliberations on the strategic plan. It's a document that I think it's going to be awfully useful for us, and it's a basis for our further discussions. So I would like to encourage the board and to take note of the management response, and then let's move into the strategy plan, where we can actually come together and discuss all these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Next is Kate.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be back here. And thank you very much to the Secretariat and team for preparing this response. And I think it's a really helpful response. And as it sets out, and Javier set out, actually much of the thinking in here and the thoughts, the recommendations, I think will be addressed in our discussions and in the development of the strategic plan. And I've got no doubt that we will pick up many of these important and complex issues in those discussions, and I'm looking forward to those very much over the course of the next few days and beyond. And I think it's really important that we do review our progress and to see where we can improve. And as Jorge said, this isn't perfect, the board isn't perfect, the GCF isn't perfect, and it's important therefore that we do learn and we do change, and the governing instrument talks about how we are a continuously learning institution, and I think this is very much a part of that. So we need to think about how we can improve the ability to deliver impact, and people have talked about that. That's why we're here. We need to deliver that impact on the ground, and that's both through strengthening the internal operating structures and processes and efficiency, but of course also how we focus our efforts and the impact on the ground based on country needs, the science, and that urgent need for action on mitigation and adaptation, and catalysing public and private finance. Again, all of those things that are set out in the governing instrument. So I think this response is a really useful input to our thinking and those discussions that we're going to have. I think it would be useful not to get too tied up in this, because we are going to have those discussions. So I would recommend, as Hans Olav did, that we note this, as we actually did in decision B2306 on the actual forward-looking performance review, which we noted. Let's take this, and then I'm looking forward to the actual discussions on the strategic plan and what we actually then turn this into and how we operationalise it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for the proposal also. Is Richard followed by Frank and then Cyril. Richard?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the management. This is useful. As you all have said, you may recall I registered my sentiments on this document in Oslo, in Canada, and I think I said something in Paris again when this was presented. There are two things. I know we are going to get time in the later discussions when we come to the strategic plan document. But as I said before, I have concerns, and I cannot, when you struggle, Javier, yes, I was waiting for you to listen to me. When you struggle to respond, there are two things you shouldn't do. One, you should note this should be a continuous process, so you don't have to tell us that you have done A, B, C, D, so we get satisfied now. But we know that it's a continuous process. In the next 4 years, we have to respond to that, and it's part of the implementation process. So that's one. But the second issue, and what I said repeatedly, as we respond to this, we cannot, we as developing countries, afford a couple of we cannot afford to move a couple of things. One, we cannot move from the instruments. So any response must respect the governing instruments. That's one. We cannot afford to go out of the contextualization of all this, which is the Convention, the Paris Agreement. And Amani said, when you talk, you see yourselves. And I can see myself talking, actually. But also, we cannot afford to have policies on the ground which actually hinder the access of resources by developing countries. When you are doing the presentation, and repeatedly I've been asking this question, you said we have 3.1 billion under implementation. You said you have 29 FAO signed, and this is 1.4 billion. You said 3.6 billion technically under implementation. You didn't say one thing, and this is the question I've been asking. What is really operation on the ground in developing countries? This is key to me. And this question must be answered for the countries to understand what is on the ground. I said this several times, and this is where I need policies which can help us to reduce the legal requirements which can take up to 4 years. Money not reaching the needy on the ground. You have people with AMA signed, FAA signed, but 4 years down the line, there is no money to developing countries. This is the issue for us. And this must be addressed in any policies we are putting in place. So I want you to respond in that way, but not necessarily at a meeting, but rather in a process, whereby we know we are going to improve in terms of the policies which can take us there, where we see money going to these people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Next is Frank.
Thank you, Nakmaldeen, and thank you to Javier for the management response on the FPR. I would like to start off with thanking also the evaluation unit on the FPR report. I think this has been a really, really valuable exercise for us, where we, as mandated by the governing instrument, need to look what are the opportunities we have at hand. The opportunities to implement this mandate where we are asked to strive to maximize the impact of the GCF for adaptation and mitigation and seeking development co-benefits. And if the FPR shows us there are opportunities which we should look at and take up in the programming for the next period, I think this is a very valuable exercise and totally in line which we have as a mandate from the governing instrument. And there are many opportunities regarding country capacities, direct access approvals, sharpening investment criteria in order to implement what has been mandated by the governing instrument to be transformative on mitigation, adaptation, and achieve higher impact. So to me, this is a really, really valuable exercise, and the way forward from my perspective has been described by many colleagues. We need to look at it on the strategic plan, look in detail what are the opportunities we want to seize, and discuss the views among board members how best to do this. And it's obvious that from the start we will not have same views on all issues. And the process in identifying where is the common ground and moving forward to implement the mandate of the governing instrument, I think is going through the strategic plan and have a forward-looking approach and not a backward-looking approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Cyril?
Thank you, Nagmeldin. I would like to thank Joe and Javier for this exercise, because I think that was really about looking ourselves into the mirror and then straighten out our clothes. And I think that what Joe delivered was clearly this kind of frank assessment that can, it can say things that we don't like to hear, but it's better to have this kind of independent and frank assessment rather than put ourselves barriers. And then I think that Javier's answer to it shows that the fund is, and the Secretariat is able to answer to this. I hear, and I completely agree that the Convention, the Paris Agreement, the governing instruments are, both our Constitution, but also the direction that this fund needs to take, and we should not shift direction. Now the question is how far and how fast can we go into this direction? How fast and how far can we go in terms of access? How fast and how far can we go in terms of impact? And this is what I think the evaluation is about, and what kind of lessons we need to take out of it. And in that case, I think obviously we should not be complacent, and obviously we can do things better, we can do things faster, we can have easier access, we can have more impact. And I've heard a lot of things, including the question of private sector. So, for instance, private sector, I agree with Ali that if you want to develop private sector, it's not just you fund private enterprise. In a lot of context, it's better to have more private sector action, to actually work on the regulatory framework, which might involve public finance. So, for instance, in this case, I do believe that having not like a strong border between what is private sector and what is public sector intervention would be valuable, and that in order to have as much leverage as possible in terms of private finance, sometimes you have to act through public instruments. Same thing between grants and non-grants. Actually, for instance, adaptation. In the case of adaptation, I do think that non-grants instruments can be valuable, like insurance market. But how do the fund needs to interact in order to develop insurance markets? It might be through grants, it might be through actually non-grant instruments. I think that in all of those cases, we need to look at the context, we need to look at whether it restrains access and whether it restrains impact. And we need to help not restraining access, taking into account the situation of the different needs of the different countries, and work in a way that maximizes the impact. So basically, once again, I want to thank you. I completely agree with Frank. The way forward, it's not like we take everything and say we sign. We will have plenty of discussions on the different items. But I would really like to deeply thank both the Independent Evaluation Unit and the Secretariat for the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. Next, Irina.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you very much, Javier, for presenting important highlights from the FPR and the management response. It was good, once again, to reflect on the priorities outlined in the report, and we look forward to seeing those priorities reflected in the strategic plan, which I hope will mature as a document for our adoption at B25. Also, it is very encouraging to learn that there have already been some good developments since we had seen the report. So I thank the Secretariat for responsive work and the commitment in increasing the fund's efficiency. On the notion of new concepts, thank you, colleagues, for raising this issue. While it is important to acknowledge that, yes, indeed, there are a number of new concepts brought forward, I would suggest that in addition to questioning those, we also work on ensuring that we calibrate those with respective governing concepts and documents. Because as an organization, we must move forward and indeed look for innovative ways to seek solutions for an increasingly growing challenge. We must accelerate our action and the speed with which we deliver our mandate. Hence, I believe that it is natural and organic to incorporate new concepts as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Ayman?
Thank you very much. I really wanted to come back again, really. There is a positive vibe around the board here. I very much agree with Hans Olaf and Frank and Cyril that we're all trying to achieve the same thing. We really want to make an impact. But it will be difficult from our side that when we go back, and especially next year is going to be a unique year. Next year is the time for parties to the Paris Agreement to update and communicate their NDCs. What story we're going to tell them? I want to take something back to them. Will I go and say we have something called theory of change? Being a thought leader, the pursuit for impact, upper frontier. They don't understand none of that. Please don't. This is not to really offend no one. This is not to demean anyone. It's, again, these terminologies, they don't relate to it. They don't understand those terminologies. They're not that they don't want to, but they don't understand them. They understand mitigation, adaptation, grants, loans. This is the jargon that they understand. When I go there and say, pursuit for impact, and now we're guided by the 1.5 degrees report, this and that, they don't like that. That means we're shifting the fund to be a GEF focusing on mitigation, which is not the case. It will not send a positive message to those you're asking them to increase their ambition. When I go with this kind of messaging, it will not help. I'm telling you, just being sort of honest with you. If I go and bring all those jargons, they will not understand for one, and for two, they will feel like there isn't anything really to increase their ambition for, because they don't see the increase in ambition in terms of financing. Before I leave the floor, Javier, how much has been really dispersed so far? It's something we really would want to know. But really, we're all trying to achieve the same thing. But the problem is that the literature that we're dealing with now, it just makes it very difficult for us to relate, frankly speaking, to this discussion. We'll have that under the strategic plan for the fund. We'll discuss it at length. But again, help us out for us to be better, perhaps equipped to respond to our constituencies. We are accountable to our constituencies, and we want to go back to them with some more solid news that financing is happening, is moving on the ground, and is moving the way they're supposed to move. Anything short of that will be really unhelpful. Thank you very much.
We'll come back to Javier when we finish with all views, and I'm sure he's noting down all questions and issues that is raised by board members. Ronnie, have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank Javier for your presentation and the Secretariat for its management response to the FPR, for which I would like to thank Joe and the IEU. The SIDS welcome both the FPR and the management response. And there's been people talking about differences of opinion. I note in the management response, for example, that while the Secretariat agrees overall with the opportunities identified by the FPR to improve its performance and consolidate the GCF, it also indicates areas where it disagrees with the performance review. That's just a natural process. In the end, it's the board that's going to decide. The FPR has made a review, which some of us may disagree with to varying extent, but we are the ones who are going to decide in the end. So I would welcome the management response because it is useful to us and helpful to us as we deliberate the FPR as we go forward and look towards the strategic plan and the work plan. But I will just remind you that we speak as the representatives of a uniquely vulnerable group of countries where the past and even the present have failed us. And where our past, and if we're not careful, our present, are sinking. So we look to the future for better ideas, new ideas, fresh ideas, rejuvenated ideas. Not just new things that we're doing that we can do better. That is the spirit in which we approach both the FPR and where we welcome the management response in helping us is another step forward. And that is the spirit in that we can very much speak for ourselves. And we have ideas, and some of us are taking very innovative steps. Some of the most innovative steps in addressing climate change are actually happening in the SIDS, with or without the assistance of the GCF. And you're going to see some of those ideas coming to the board in future. I'm aware of some of them happening in the Caribbean, for example. New sort of funding proposals that will come forward. Where we are isolated in the oceans that we belong, if we are not bold enough to sail beyond the horizon while not knowing what's beyond the horizon, we wouldn't have survived until now. So we do not fear the FPR. We do not fear any evaluation that comes forward. We know it is made in an honest and a positive spirit, and we welcome that. And we welcome the advice of our friends, while I underscore what my colleagues from the developing countries have said about the overarching importance and priority, preeminence of the governing instrument, the UNFCCC, the Convention, the Paris Agreement. There are no countries which are more wedded to these than the SIDS. Our very survival. For us, it's like a life raft. It's stuck around our neck. Without it, we sink completely. So I just wanted to let you know how we welcome all these processes, and in the case of you have to do a decision on this, we, the SIDS, we welcome the response. We see it as a very useful document as we go forward to further deliberate on how we're going to address and what we're going to accept or adopt from the FPR and what we're not going to agree to. That's just a normal process like everything that GCF has been doing from the start. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you. Lorena, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Javier, for the presentation, and the colleague for their intervention as well. I think the document, as our Ambassador has already said, is very useful to have this kind of review, how the fund has been working, having the recommendation. But I agree that some of the recommendation we cannot accept it in full. We need to discuss. They are part of the strategic plan and should be discussed in that setting. So we agree also the GCF has to evolve because we are maturing. Our constituency also is maturing, but we are facing, as Eamon said, the NDC updating, and so that is part of the recommendation that I would like to see in the report. Most of our constituency, our developing country, are presenting, updating NDC, and there needs new NDC, and that should be reflected also, and maybe give the proper balance between that the convention set, the objective or the mission of this fund, with the new evolution of the fund as well. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. I would like now to give the floor to Lydie.
Thank you, Co-Chair. CSO observers have welcomed and appreciated many of the recommendations of the IEU's forward-looking performance review. And this was a significant undertaking, and we are glad to see that in the Secretariat's response, it is being treated as such, and that the Secretariat agrees with many of the central findings and plans to act on them accordingly. We note that quite a few responses indicate that these issues are to be dealt with in the strategic plan and recognize that efforts have been taken to do so. But please allow us to add 3 concerns in this discussion. First, we are concerned with the Secretariat's response to item 2.2 that, and I quote, the role and participation of civil society organizations and indigenous peoples is ensured through consultations done during project design and implementation, unquote. As evidenced by our continued intervention on project proposals, accreditation applications, and GCF policies, there remains significant room for improvement in this regard. The strategic plan will be an excellent opportunity to affirm the GCF's commitment to participatory processes in all activities, including robust support for CSOs, indigenous peoples, and other relevant stakeholder groups. We are happy to offer to be involved in all processes identified by the Secretariat in responding to the findings of the FPR. Second, we'd like to express serious concerns on how the GCF's risk appetite is operationalized across the fund. We note that in many instances, risk is understood mainly in terms of financial risk that is about leveraging larger volumes and shifting risk from private sector to the fund. The fund, we believe, should use a more expansive definition of risk that focuses on working with vulnerable sectors who other entities see as too risky to work with and who are therefore unable to access finance. The GCF risk appetite should reinforce work with direct access entities and community organizations, taking on less financial risk quantitatively, but providing much needed de-risking for these critical activities. These activities would include financing of small-scale innovative activities, including supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises or smallholder agricultural programs, and channeling much-needed resources to under-financed communities. In these cases, taking on smaller risk burdens can have high dividends. The GCF's approach to risk should take this into account and not simply consider risk as programming larger quantities of less concessional funding. Finally, we would like also to take note that on several occasions, the Secretariat requests clarity on items related to overlapping policies that may have unclear mandates, structures of intersection, or delegation of authority. We agree that this work is vital and urge the board to request such an analysis be undertaken of all existing GCF policies and frameworks, either by the Secretariat or the IEU, to clarify how the GCF's various policies are interrelated and to identify any potential contradictions, overlapping mandates, and explore solutions to enhance the fund's effectiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I will turn now to Secretariat for a brief response. I don't think you need to respond to everything, maybe the key question that you have here. I also aware that we're already approaching our time for lunch. I'm sure you are hungry by now. So I'll ask Secretariat, and Joe, if you have very short intervention, very short, because here we're discussing mostly the management response. Javier?
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you very much, members of the board, for all of your comments. We definitely appreciate all of them, particularly those who are ready to welcome and take notes of the management response. I would like to add a few comments, particularly on adaptation finance, and perhaps take this as my own views. I think the fact that we are talking about the non-grant to the adaptation financing is very good news. It is, in essence, what it means, it is becoming competitive. It means that it's generating revenues. It means that it doesn't rely only on grants. It means there is a lot of room for growth and improvement and adaptation. So that's the way I see it. And similarly on co-financing, the fact that we can also crowd in additional funding to developing countries, I also see it as a positive indicator. Indeed, important to have delineation of responsibilities and delineation of roles and accountabilities, particularly when we talk about independent units within the GCF fund. There's been a couple of questions about the disbursements, and I also would like to provide maybe clear answers. Yes, indeed, the portfolio of the GCF of approved funding proposals is $5.2 billion, from which we have signed FAA agreements on $3.6 billion, approximately. And out of 3.6, 3.2 are already under implementation. What do we mean by being under implementation? We mean that those projects have already received one funding, one disbursement at least. Now, the immediate question is, so what's the total amount of funding that the GCF has already transferred? And the answer is, at this point, is about $750 million, also approximately, with a projection of ending the year slightly over $800 million. Also with a projection of triggering the $1 billion between the first and the second quarter of 2020, and with an estimation to finish 2020 between $1.3 and $1.6 billion on disbursements. But now the question goes beyond that. The question is, so how much of that is on the ground? And for that, as we all know, the GCF is a partnership institution, it's a partnership fund. So what it means is that we rely on accredited entities, those that brought the funding proposals, right, on these ones. And we also rely on the beneficiaries, whether sponsors, countries, etc. So it does not depend on us, on whether we can disperse faster. It depends on whether the project is ready, whether the project is meeting the deadlines, whether or not the accredited entity is prioritizing, is putting in as much as they can so that we move on, and also whether or not the sponsor, the beneficiary, is complying with the terms of the either grant agreement or loan agreement. So that's in essence a part of the response on disbursement. Definitely, we will take note and see how we can calibrate new concepts with those that pertain to the UNFCCC, to the Paris Agreement, and to our governing instrument. Room for improvement from the CSOs to participate on the funding proposals, even from concept note design. So definitely we take note of that. And co-chair, if you are agreeable, and maybe we should pass the floor to now to Yopuri.
Thank you, Afir.
Thank you, co-chair. So mine are very brief comments, and I just wanted to allude to a few things that did come up during this discussion, but also at previous discussions. First, I do want to reiterate that we've held the governing instrument in the Paris Agreement as sacred. This is really important as a clarification. That was the starting off point for us, and that's something that we found we took as incontrovertible and as our sacred starting off document. And everything that we've said is essentially in the FPR. Definitely, it is an attempt to triangulate a diversity of views, a diversity of mandates, and a diversity of starting points for a lot of countries and people that are also represented on this board. But the attempt has been to really try and understand as to how GCF can really deliver its mandate for developing countries in a way that is faster, better, and smarter. And so the recommendations that have come forward, I hope the board will appreciate, are really meant to be practicable. We started from a point which is extremely rigorous, but the recommendations are meant to be practicable, that are oriented towards getting the GCF to deliver the biggest impact for developing country needs. And that's really important in recognizing and using the lens that we use to understand the recommendations as well. And last but not least, Co-Chair, I do want to end with saying that much like the rest of the world, we're not perfect either. And we'd really like to hear from all of you, and especially the board members, as to how we can do a better job the next time. We are very open for your counsel, for your advice, and we really look forward to that engagement as we go along. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. I think we had very good discussion, very rich, and I'm sure this will inform the Secretariat response, and also is helpful also to the independent unit, evaluation unit, also in her future work. And I appreciate that very much. And I just would like to inform you that we will prepare a draft decision noting the management response, and this will come to you during this meeting for your consideration and adoption.